Time for you to rethink.
You know the word annihilate? It means reduce to nothing.
Perished means killed.
We know what perished means.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Rethinking Hell Live, where evangelical Christians discuss what the Bible says about hell and put conventional and controversial views to the test. Join the discussion in YouTube's live chat, or email your feedback, questions, and episode suggestions to live@rethinkinghell.com. Rethinking Hell is on Facebook as well, and be sure to check us out on Patreon if you'd like to become a supporter of the show. See the description below for all links and details, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for future updates.
Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Rethinking Hell Live. My name is Chris Date, and before you do anything else, and before I do anything else, please do give me a thumbs up or something in the chat to let me know if you can see and hear me clearly. I am having some technical issues on my side of things. I don't think they're interfering with the stream and your ability to see and hear me, but let me know if that's not the case. As I often do at the beginning of the stream, I just want to encourage you to please, after the video is over, if you enjoyed what you watched, click that thumbs up like button in YouTube and subscribe to our channel if you like our content and what it is that we're trying to accomplish here at our ministry. Also, in case you're not aware, merely subscribing to a YouTube channel does not get you notifications when new content has been made available. And so if you want those kinds of notifications, or if you'd just like to help all of the algorithms and everything get our channel and our videos exposure elsewhere on YouTube, then go ahead and also click that notifications bell. All three of those things, like, subscribe, and notifications, we'd be very grateful for all of that. Also, just by way of reminder, we are, at least for the time being, entirely donation funded. We don't have a monetized channel. We don't have a store at which we sell merchandise or anything like that. So if you appreciate what we do here, please do consider giving a one-time or recurring donation of any amount. Any little amount you have to give would be grateful. Would be very much appreciated. And if you want to help support the ministry, you can do so by going to rethinkinghell.com and clicking on the PayPal button, or by going to patreon.com/rethinkinghell. Thank you, those of you in the chat who've indicated that you can see and hear me. Let me tell you what's going to happen in today's episode of the show. In a recent debate that I participated in, one of my opponents pretended as if he could read my heart and my mind, and he said that a particular argument that I've come to use long after becoming a conditionalist was a sort of emotional argument that swayed me to believe in conditional immortality in the first place. Now, we addressed that in the debate, and we addressed it in post-debate review episodes here on Rethinking Hell Live. But the issue, the argument that my opponent pretended he could read my heart and mind about was that long after becoming a conditionalist, I began to realize that there is a good argument to be made against the doctrine of eternal torment based on the seeming inconsistency or incompatibility between, on the one hand, the saints, the resurrected saints, experiencing bliss uninterrupted, unmitigated, unremitting, all throughout eternity, while at the same time knowing that their lost loved ones are suffering in hell. Again, this is not something that ever occurred to me or really gave me any reason to doubt the traditional view prior to becoming a conditionalist, and it was several years after becoming a conditionalist that I started to think of this argument as fairly powerful, and I've been putting it into service ever since then. Well, recently, a Facebook friend alerted me to a YouTube video in which the host was interviewing a Christian philosopher, analytic philosopher. We'll find out from my guest here in a moment, just exactly what kind of philosophy we're talking here, but the philosopher in question had published a chapter in a book on philosophy a few years ago, and then more recently co-authored a book on introductory philosophy for Christians, in which he talks about this particular argument. And he's coming from a perspective of somebody who believes in eternal torment, and he tries to offer some plausible answers to the challenge. And some of those may be challenges or maybe answers to the solution that we conditionalists might be able to leverage as well. And I thought it would be really interesting to have the host of that show, who did the interview, on Rethinking Hell Live to discuss his guest's proposals. So that's what we're going to be doing today. My guest will be Jordan Hampton, and you'll be hearing all about him in just a moment. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into today's interview. All right, Jordan Hampton, I'm not going to say a whole bunch about you. I'll let you tell us about yourself. But first, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me, and it's a real privilege to have you here.
Thank you very much, Chris, for inviting me on.
Again, if people in the chat could just give me a thumbs up and let me know that you can see and hear my guest, Jordan, clearly, I'd appreciate that. I'm encouraged, since you've already told me that you can hear and see me, but just let me know that you can hear and see him as well. So as I said, my guest today is Jordan Hampton. We're going to learn about him before we start talking about his recent interview that he conducted. And I'd like to begin, Jordan, with your testimony or your faith background. You know, people that have followed me for any period of time will know that I was an atheist up until about 21 years old, which is about 20 years ago now. And, you know, there's a fairly uninteresting story about how I became a Christian and so forth, but I wasn't raised in a Christian household or anything like that. What about you? Were you raised in an ostensibly Christian household, or, you know, did you believe very early on, or did you come to faith later in life? Tell us about that.
I did grow up in a Christian household. My mom was a Sunday school teacher, and I was regularly attending in her class. However, I would say I didn't get saved until I was 20, so during my college years. So I definitely knew a lot of stuff from having gone to Sunday school and church all those years, but in terms of actually committing my life, I would say that happened when I was 20. I guess in short, what turned me around was I was living a really sinful life and felt really empty and unfulfilled. And I got introduced by a friend to John Piper's book called Don't Waste Your Life. And his motto of God being most glorified in you when you're most satisfied in him was like a light bulb moment for me. And I was like, wow. That's like the key to life right there. All these unfulfilled, I feel so unfulfilled. But John Piper's telling me that God can actually satisfy all the hungers of my heart that I was seeking in other places but couldn't find. And so I didn't believe it at first, but I started to pray and say, God, if you really can be that good and that fulfilling, then I want you. And that is when I gave my life to, after praying that for a while, I had a really powerful religious experience, and I committed my life to God. And so it wasn't too long after that that I got into apologetics. And so I don't know. Do you want me to say something about that?
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next question, as you know. So your ministry, which I'll let you talk about in a moment, is really focused on, you could say, Christian philosophical theology, or you could say philosophy and theology, or you could say analytic theology, it seems to me. What would you call your area of your primary interest, and where did that interest come from? And what prompted you to start to want to get into this particular kind of field?
Yeah. Well, I definitely started out into apologetics, but so I read like Lee Strobel, and then Lee Strobel led me to William Lane Craig and Greg Koukl, and then I'd go and I'd read those guys, and they led me to other people, and you just kind of follow the trail, and eventually I was reading like peer-reviewed journal articles and books like with academic presses, published by academic presses. So like high level stuff. But what I got frustrated with was they had really good answers to very difficult questions, But this stuff was staying pretty much locked away in university libraries, and I wanted
like
to
the
see,
ivory tower.
yeah, the ivory towers. And so I wanted to see this stuff like become public knowledge that was easily not only accessible in the sense of people can get access to what these guys are saying, but somebody to make it understandable so that you it can be easily understood, basically. And I'm a teacher. That's my full-time job, so I thought I can use my skills to try and take like the high level stuff and be the bridge to the layman. And that's what I try to do on my channel, is take the analytic philosophy and philosophical theology that I'm reading and make it to where it's very accessible for lay people. And my hope is that over time this will elevate the discussion between believers and non-believers, because a lot of times it's very emotionally charged, and that's understandable to an extent, but there's often a lack of respect for people, but also just an unawareness of real rigorous work that's being done. And you see like bad objections, and this happens both ways: Christians objecting to atheist things and atheists objecting to Christian things, and it happens both ways. And I just want to see the whole conversation elevated.
Yeah.
So that's what I try to do on my channel.
Well, very cool. Tell us about that channel. What is it called, and how can viewers get tuned into it?
It's called the Analytic Christian, and it's a YouTube channel. You can go and subscribe. I would appreciate that. And I also have a podcast. Now, the podcast is pretty new, so I have 3 episodes so far, but you can check that out as well if you like podcasts. It's the same name, The Analytic Christian. And probably the easiest way to just find out like everything is to go to my website, which is theanalyticchristian.com. So I've got blog posts there, interactive slides that will teach you like Reformed epistemology, for example, and access to like playlists of my videos and stuff. So I would go check that out.
Awesome. Well, I hope that viewers will do that. Let's start talking about the topic of our ministry here at Rethinking Hell, which is, well, hell. When I became a Christian, as I've said on a number of occasions, having had almost no exposure to a Christian theology up until the time I became a believer, there were nevertheless 2 things that I knew I should believe as a new baby Christian. One of those is that I probably ought to make the Bible my authority. It seemed like that's what Christians do. And the second thing is the wicked will suffer forever in hell. That's just something that I picked up from the surrounding culture. It's in movies, it's in TV and cartoons and all over the place. And for the next roughly 10 years, I was perfectly content with believing that. Very early on in my faith, I became a Calvinist, and not saying that Calvinism is right or wrong, but one of the things I came to appreciate very early on is that God is just and will prove to be, even if I can't always understand how right now. And so it wasn't something, the doctrine of eternal torment, that ever gave me, consternation or kept me up at night or anything like that. And about 10 years after I became a believer, which is now about 10 years ago, I ended up having my mind changed purely by the exegetical case for conditional immortality. All of the emotions that were involved all pulled me in the direction of the tradition for reasons that I've talked about on a number of occasions. But I just wanted to sketch out my story of going from the doctrine of eternal torment to conditional immortality to sort of set the stage for you to tell us your story. So on the topic of hell, what has been your belief in the past, and where do you stand now, and why?
I definitely grew up thinking that the people that go to hell are there forever. They will be conscious, and they will be experiencing suffering. And I definitely grew up thinking, well, I already said they're there forever, so that's not like later that state will change. It's just they're locked in that conscious torment forever. So I would say I grew up with the traditional view. Now, I don't know that I definitely saw images of like flames and things, but I don't know if I really believed that people were like being burned or something like
I
that.
don't think I ever believed that either. I always sort of took the, separation, kind of like an everlasting exile or prison sentence kind of view.
Yeah. What changed my mind was, well, the way that it got started. I watched your video with Bobby Conway on the 1 Minute
All
Apologist.
right.
And I had just finished studying like the historical Adam and Eve for my own satisfaction, like reading different views on that. And so I'd reached a kind of point of, I was wrapping that up and I was looking for like the next thing that I wanted to begin researching on my own. And I saw that video and I was like, because you issued, if I remember correctly, you issued a kind of challenge in that video, which was like, study this for yourself, look into it. So I was like, okay, I will. And I was shocked. I was really shocked.
Yeah.
Because it's the eternal conscious torment view is so commonly held that you just think there's going to be a ton of biblical support for it. And probably the thing that did the most work on me the most quickly was, it's a podcast episode you did called like, I forgot the title, but it's basically you go through all the texts that someone of an eternal conscious torment view would offer, and you show how they actually show conditional immortality. That alone didn't change my mind, but that alone made me go, wow, this has something going for it.
Viewers want.
So then I ended up
really
reading,
quick, just for the viewers' sake, if they want to check that podcast episode out, I suspect that you're talking about episode 7 of our podcast, which was my episode called "Traditionalist Objections Answered" or something like that.
Yes.
So,
That's
viewers,
it. Yeah,
maybe check that out. But anyway, go ahead. Keep telling your story.
So then I read Edward Fudge. I started with his little book, Hell, a Final Word. And that one was like an avalanche of scripture in favor of conditional immortality. So I was like, wow, this is taught all over the Bible. And then I checked out his book, The Fire That Consumes. Specifically, I was most interested in how he dealt with Revelation, because I was like, that's where the case is going to be the strongest for the eternal conscious torment view. And I was pretty satisfied with what he did with Revelation. I started to turn to what the proponents of eternal conscious torment thought, and I think there's a book called Hell Interrupted. Am I right? It's been a few years.
I'm not familiar with the book. No, Hell Interrupted is a blog article series published by Stand to Reason, Greg Kokel and Tim
What's
Burnett.
the book?
Hell Under Fire?
It's got like a ton of scholars.
Hell Under Fire.
That defend. What is
Hell
it?
Under Fire?
Hell Under Fire. I couldn't remember
That's
the title.
okay.
I read that book, and I was just completely underwhelmed by the defenses offered there. So then my mind really started to change when I saw what a poor defense was offered there. And yeah, I guess it wasn't too long after that I was like, yeah, I think my mind's been changed now, and I hold the conditional immortality. I don't know how confident I am in it. Like, I definitely think that's my view. My mind could be changed, but I probably hold that view like more weakly than maybe like other Christian doctrines, but I still am pretty confident in it.
Good. Well, glad to hear, and it's really, thank you, Susan, in the chat for linking to that podcast episode. And yeah, Jordan, thank you for honoring us at Rethinking Hell with being a part of your journey. Even if at some point you end up going back to the other side, the fact that you took your time and you researched it and you let us be a part of that journey means a lot to us. Before we get to the interview that you recently conducted and which prompted me to invite you on the show, because your area of primary interest is analytic theology, Christian philosophy and theology, however you want to put that, I wanted to ask you this question. It seems to me that most of the sort of rigorous, careful, philosophical thinking that has been given to the topic of hell has been done either in favor of universalism or in the defense of eternal torment against universalism, while it seems that kind of rigorous philosophical thing has not really been, there hasn't been a lot of that given to the doctrine of conditional immortality, probably just because very few, relatively speaking, of sort of the, respected philosophers out there are conditionalists. One notable example is Jim Spiegel. Another one is Matthew Flanagan. But most philosophers, as I said, are either in exercising philosophy in defense of universalism or in defense of eternal torment from universalism. That's my impression. Do you get an impression like that too? And if there is any degree of truth to that, what elements or truth claims of conditionalism do you think might benefit from some careful, rigorous philosophical thinking that maybe hasn't yet been applied to this or that subtopic within our view?
Yes, I want to say this as a kind of disclaimer. I think the thing that changed my mind was the exegetical stuff, not the philosophical stuff. That had maybe a little bit of a role, but mostly just exegetical. So I'm not an authority on what has been published on the philosophical side of things, but I guess now in my journey, that's kind of something that I'm interested in exploring more now. So I have a team of like 15 philosophers that are professional that like vet all my work. So I asked them because they're going to be way more well read than me. I asked one of them, "Hey, Chris wants to know if this is the trend. What do you think?" And here's what I'll just read you what this person said. They said, "I actually don't know any philosophers off the top of my head who have defended annihilationism in print. My impression is that universalism and natural consequence models of hell, which eternal conscious torment would be a natural consequence model, one type of it, are the most popular views among philosophers." So I think your hunch is right, and philosophers who defend universalism, I actually want to read this book. It's called God's Final Victory. Apparently it's really
Eric Reitan
a really
and,
strongly argued philosophical case.
Yeah, Eric Reitan and his co-author, right?
Yeah, so Cronin,
That's right.
I think is the guy's last name. Then Marilyn Adams, John Hick, Thomas Talbot, and even recently Josh Rasmussen defend universalism. And they're all good philosophers. Especially, I've got a ton of respect for Dr. Rasmussen. And then philosophers who've defended kind of natural consequence models have been John Kvanvig.
Kvanvig, yeah, I'm not trying to pronounce his name either.
Even Stephen Davis, so I've interviewed him a couple times. He defends that. Eleanor Stump, they're more common. And then you've got retributive models that are still eternal conscious torment, and like William Lane Craig and Jerry Walls would defend models like that. But yeah, I think it's not common to find annihilationist philosophers.
Well, as I said, one notable exception is Jim Spiegel. He recently published a book that at least includes one or two chapters on this very issue. Not the issue we're discussing today, but conditional immortality. So I'll be interested to see him and possibly you in the future publish more. To answer my own question a little bit, I'll say two examples that come to my mind of subtopics within conditionalism that I think would benefit from some rigorous philosophical thought. One is, this is something that I've come to appreciate because of the work of a philosopher whose name I've forgotten. He recently published a book through Oxford University Press, I think it was, called Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God, or Sinners in the Presence of a Loving God.
Guillaume Bignon?
No.
Or something like that?
Guillaume is a Calvinist. He hasn't published on this topic at all. He publishes on Calvinism. But anyway, in it, he argues that that because God is by nature love, then all of his actions to all of his creatures, including those actions that he performs in sentencing the lost to hell, must be expressions of his love, or at the very least sort of consistent with his love. The sentencing of the lost to hell must itself be loving, because God, who is love, is the one who is doing it. Now, I will say that while I find that to be somewhat compelling, I'm not convinced that capital punishment can't be an expression of love. But I'm, again, not a philosopher, and so I'd love to see a conditionalist philosopher think through that issue and see how that might be able to be defended. And one other example I'll give, and then we'll move on to my next line of questions, is both the doctrine of eternal torment and conditional immortality have a challenge to face when it comes to the duration of the punishment Christ bore in our place. I think that the doctrine of eternal torment faces a much, much, much bigger challenge there, because the punishment Jesus bore was not torment while immortal and alive. It was death. It was the privation of his life, which is what we conditionalists think awaits the lost in hell as well. The difference, however, is that in either case, eternal torment or conditionalism, that punishment was it lasted either a few hours in the case of the doctrine of eternal torment, or a few days in the case of conditional immortality, whereas both of those two sides of the debate think that the punishment awaiting the resurrected lost will be everlasting, infinite in duration. But we just disagree on what the nature of that is. So another area I'd like to see a conditionalist philosopher give some rigorous philosophical thinking to is how to account for the fact that Christ was dead for roughly 3 days, but the lost will be dead for eternity after they're killed in hell. So those are two examples, just maybe to get your wheels turning as a budding conditionalist philosopher. Before I move on, did you want to come back on that at all, or?
The only thing I'll say about that second point, I guess, so that's going to have a lot to do with how you cash out the atonement. And there are a lot of different views and like sub-views on the atonement. So you may think, I'm convinced of a substitutionary theory of the atonement. Well, there's different views of how that substitution works. And so I'm going to be doing an interview at the end of the month with Richard Swinburne, where he defends his view of the atonement. I find his view really interesting, at the least. And he a lot of it will be cashed out in terms of like a debt owed. So I see promising avenues maybe of thinking of it as a debt owed and how you're going to pay that debt.
Cool. Well, I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Let's shift gears now to the context of that interview that you conducted recently, beginning with the specific issue you interviewed him about. I mentioned that the thought of me somehow struggling to enjoy eternity forever might be stymied by the knowledge that my lost loved ones are suffering in hell. That was something that never played into my thinking until several years after I became a conditionalist. But what about you? Did that ever strike you, either before or after becoming a conditionalist, strike you as something that is a little bit hard to explain? How you, upon being raised from the grave and made immortal to live in the blissful presence of God forever, how that could be consistent with your knowledge that your lost loved ones either are suffering in hell forever or were killed in hell, never to live again. Was that something that ever struck you as a challenge, or something that you couldn't quite explain?
That never occurred to me. The first time I remember coming across this objection was in an article that William Lane Craig wrote, where he offers his solution to the problem, but I had never thought of it before on my own.
Interesting. Okay, well, so you ended up inviting Eric Yang onto your show to discuss that. Who is Eric Yang? Tell us who Eric Yang is and how it is that you guys know each other.
So he's a professor of philosophy at Santa Clara University, which is out, I think, in California, pretty sure. And he got in contact with me. I was really excited when this happened. So I had seen this book on Amazon, and had actually added it to my list to try and get. And he actually sent me a message and asked if he could send me a free copy for me to read, and if I enjoyed it, maybe consider an interview. So I can't recommend this book highly enough. I wish more Christians were familiar with theology, and specifically using the tools of philosophy to look at it. So this is a phenomenal book. Buy this right now. It's going to give you the perfect introduction to a wide variety of issues in Christian philosophical theology. So that's how I met him. He contacted me, and then after I did my interview with him on the Trinity, we stayed in contact, and he sent me this paper that he had published in a book called The Philosophy of Heaven. I'm pretty sure that's the title. And it's chapter 8 of that book. And so he said, take a look at this chapter I wrote and see if you're interested in doing an interview. So I read it, and I thought, yeah, this would be a great interview. So then we just did that interview last week.
Yeah, so this is hot off the presses, as it were. And you've kind of already answered my second question, because I was going to ask you about that chapter. It's chapter 8, I think, in the book that you're talking about, and the title of the chapter is Heaven and the Problem of Eternal Separation. The book is Heaven and Philosophy, and it's published by Rowman and Littlefield back in 2017. Let's say, though, that listeners had to choose between either downloading that chapter, which you link to in your interview, or buying that book and getting the less detailed, the less comprehensive treatment of this topic. If what they want is the treatment of this topic, which of those two do you think?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, certainly this chapter. And this is free. You don't have to buy the whole book. I put a link to it in my video. You can click the link and read this. So in terms of this topic, this is way more detailed. Okay.
But I'm interested in getting the book myself as well. So if listeners have a little bit of free money, sitting in their back pocket or something like that.
I think it's like $12 or $13. Yeah. So it's affordable.
Good. Okay. All right. Well, we'll discuss in a little bit later in the interview the extent to which this may or may not be a problem for us conditionalists, and we'll discuss whether any of Yang's proposed solutions or any others are available to us conditionalists. But I want to begin by focusing particularly on the doctrine of eternal torment and lay out the problem as Yang does in that context. So I've sort of touched on it here and there, but you, when you interviewed Dr. Yang, you were able to flesh it out in a little bit more detail. So maybe you can walk us through what this problem purports to be in the context of the doctrine of eternal torment.
Yeah. So to put it simply, there's a tension between a traditional Christian teaching on heaven and either the eternal conscious torment of hell or the annihilation view of hell. There's a tension there. And probably the easiest way to get at it is through a question, but I don't think a question in of itself is going to be sufficient. I'll say something about that here in a second. But the question would be, how can the saints in heaven enjoy heaven while knowing that their loved ones are in hell? Mm. So how can those in heaven enjoy it knowing that they've got loved ones in hell? That's probably the fastest way to get at the tension. And the thing is, though, as my friend Cameron Bertuzzi likes to point out, he runs the YouTube channel Capturing Christianity, questions aren't arguments. So you may have a good question, but it's not an argument with like some conclusion that you have supported. So I think it's best to lay out the real argument so that you see exactly what's happening. I don't know if I can share my screen. We didn't talk about this. If I can, let me know, and if I can, I can just read the argument.
Why don't you read it, because I don't want to accidentally mess up the audio and stuff by getting your shared screen up.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, this argument, it's got a total of 5 steps in it, and that last step, the 5th one, is the conclusion that you're supposed to believe on the basis of the other 4. So we'll just walk through these one step at a time. The first premise in the argument, the first step, is anyone in a state of eternal blessedness possesses both perfect bliss and continued love for their premortem beloved. So what that's saying is just, if you're in a state of pure joy, pure bliss in heaven, then and you also have this love for your beloved. That's the kind of conception of heaven we're working with. You're in pure bliss and you have love for the people you loved in your earthly life. That's basically the first premise of the argument. The second says anyone who possesses love for their premortem beloved and is aware that those persons are eternally damned. You could substitute eternally damned with eternally punished, because conditionalist Chris and I want to say they're eternally punished. So anyone who still loves their premortem beloved and they're aware that those persons are eternally punished can't possess perfect bliss. That's the second step in the argument. The third is the conclusion. You can't deny this without denying one of those first two steps.
Well, just to be clear,
this
just to be clear, the third isn't the conclusion. It's sort of an intermediate conclusion, right? It becomes the premise.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, it's like on our way. Right. I'm just trying to make the point that this follows from those first two, so you can't like shoot this one down without denying one of those first two. So this one says, so anyone who is aware that their premortem beloved is eternally damned or punished cannot possess eternal blessedness. All right, and then from there we just go, if a premortem, this is the fourth step, if a premortem beloved is eternally damned or punished, then any lover of the premortem beloved who possesses eternal blessedness would be aware of this. Now that's an important premise. It's saying that if you've got somebody that you loved in your earthly life and they're in hell being punished, in whatever sense you cash out punishment, then if you love them, you're going to possess an awareness that they're being punished. So that's an important premise. Now the fifth, this is the end of the argument, and again this follows from the previous steps, so you can't shoot this one down without shooting down one of the others. So if a premortem beloved is eternally damned, then no lover of the earthly beloved possesses eternal blessedness. So that's the formal argument. You end up having, at least the argument aims to show that if you've got somebody that you loved that's in hell, then you can't be in a state of pure bliss or eternal blessedness in heaven. Right.
And one thing I really like about the way that Dr. Yang fleshes this out, this sort of lengthy syllogism. I don't know, does the word syllogism apply when you've actually got four premises and a conclusion? Or, I mean, you would know better than me because I'm not a philosopher.
As far as I know,
okay.
Yes, it would still apply, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, in any event, the reason I like the way he fleshes this out is because he makes a very small, subtle, but really critical, I think, change to almost the same argument laid out by Reitan and Kroner, or did I just mispronounce his last name?
Cronin, I think is his name. Cronin.
Right, and that key difference is that premortem beloved, right? Because the way they say it is just love for people in general, and Dr. Yang observes, and I think rightly, that it's at least plausible that it's specifically the love for premortem beloved that makes for a challenge. Would you agree with me there that is one of the big improvements?
I do think this is more. Yang's version is more intuitive, I guess I should say. You grasp it more quickly and easily when it's already somebody that you love deeply. It's not quite as tangible or real when it's just this kind of love in general. So I think in that sense it's a stronger argument. But I still think as Christians we're called to love our enemies, and so I feel like it's still a good argument. Even on the other view.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there. But like you said, it's intuitively more powerful. And arguably, it is appropriate to have a higher level of love for your loved ones than for somebody you've never met in Indonesia or something like that. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but that's neither here nor there. So with that syllogism laid out, let's start talking about the solutions that Yang explores in his treatment of the topic. And he begins by exploring two answers that Christians have historically offered to this challenge, albeit to the challenge as it had been previously cashed out with not as much rigor philosophically as Dr. Yang did and Reitan and Cronin before him. And the first of those two historical solutions to the problem is the one offered by the likes of, but not by no means limited to, Thomas Aquinas and Jonathan Edwards. So tell us, what is the gist of Aquinas's and Edwards' answer to this challenge?
Okay, let me just prep how to think about each one of these responses that are offered. So we just gave an argument, and Yang offers this argument, and it's important when coming up with a response to make sure that your response actually targets one of the steps in the argument, and it shouldn't be a step that is a conclusion that follows from others, like I mentioned. So the only options we have with this argument that I gave is you either got to deny 1, 2, or 4. steps 1, 2, or 4. 3 followed from 1 and 2, and 5 followed from the previous one. So 3 and 5 are out. You got to deny 1, 2, or 4. So it's important to just keep that in mind when you go through the argument and you're formulating a response. Figure out which premise you're actually going to deny. So this first solution, the one that is offered by Thomas Aquinas and Jonathan Edwards, denies that second premise. That's the premise that said that if you possess love for your premortem beloved and you're aware that that person is damned, you can't possess perfect bliss. Okay, so they're going to deny that. And the way that Aquinas and Jonathan Edwards, from what I'm gathering, goes a little bit farther than Aquinas. Basically, the thought is those in heaven won't actually be filled with like sorrow or grief when looking at their. When I say looking at, I just mean kind of an awareness of their loved ones who are in hell. They won't be filled with sorrow or grief. They'll actually be filled with gratitude, and they'll be rejoicing. And you may think, how exactly does that work? So it's not that they're rejoicing in their pain necessarily. What they're rejoicing in is that God, his perfect justice is being carried out. So they'll be rejoicing because justice is being done, and they'll also be rejoicing because God, through his grace, has spared them that awful fate that they're aware of. So they're grateful that they've been spared of a terrible fate.
Right.
That's the basic response. Do you want me to say anything else about
well,
it?
I will in a moment, but I want to add another caveat's not the right word, but because you mentioned the importance of targeting a premise, I want to also mention that when you have the proposed answers we're going to be going through none of them has to be the right answer to the question. This is sort of similar to the logical problem of evil, right? If the now long since debunked logical problem of evil is the idea that it's logically incompatible for God to be omnibenevolent and omniscient and omnipotent, and for there to be evil. And all that a Christian has to do, all a theist has to do, is say, here's one possible reason why an omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent God would permit the existence of evil. And even if that's not the actual reason that God did it, the fact that there is one possible answer to it means that there may be others, and it defeats the argument. At least that's how I would explain it. And I would say that the same thing applies here. If any one of the four solutions that we're going to be going through is plausible, then it seems like there may be others that we just haven't thought of yet. And so any one of them, if plausible, I think would defeat the argument. Do you think I'm more or less right in the way that I've played the Keshe?
Yes, this is the difference between what philosophers call a defense and a theodicy. So a defense wants to lay out a possible reason that God has for permitting X. Whatever X is just some horrible thing, basically, some horrendous evil. And a theodicy wants to lay out what God's actual reasons are. So you don't have to think of these as God's actual reasons. So we're not necessarily offering a theodicy, we're just offering a defense. These could be possible reasons God has.
Good. Okay. All right. So having now sort of offered the gist of the Edwardsian, Aquinasian, Thomist, I suppose is what I should say there, answer to the solution, where do you find this solution, or maybe I should say, where does Yang find this solution lacking, and do you share his rejection of this argument as being fairly implausible?
I definitely share his rejection. And I say that very confidently. Someone could change my mind. I'm open, but from what I'm seeing, this is just not an attractive view at all. What Yang describes as the weakness is that it misses the point. So we want to, Yang agrees, and I would want to agree as well, that we do want to rejoice and take pleasure in God carrying out justice. I mean, we don't. What are we supposed to say? We enjoy injustice. So we want God to carry out His perfect justice. That's a good thing, and we definitely want to be grateful for God's grace in saving us. That's not something we earned. That's part of the Christian message. This is by God's grace that we're saved through faith. So we want to be grateful for that. He didn't have to do that. But it misses the point, because even if you have reasons to rejoice in, say, those in hell suffering a fate that they deserve, you still have reason to be sad or experience grief because you're separated from a loved one.
Yeah.
It's not like those two reasons. You can have reasons for both, is the point. And an analogy, Dr. Yang gives a different analogy. I think I might prefer this one. Maybe his is better. It seems to me like, say there's some really loving grandma that, just bakes the whole neighborhood cookies. She's just the best grandma ever. And she's got a grandson who ends up doing some horrible crime and is put in prison. And she knows that he did it. He tells her, I did it. And he might even be a really rotten person and be like, I don't regret that I did it. So he could be a really crummy person, and she may think justice was carried out. He deserves that fate. But I still think that it's totally reasonable for the grandma to be sad that she will never, say he gets a lifetime sentence. It just seems to me like she would be totally reasonable to be sad and express sorrow that she's, for the rest of his life, separated from him.
Yeah, very good. So, in other words, it's not that the saved in eternity won't rejoice over the fact that justice is done and so forth. It's that they can and very likely will, but they'll also have cause for grief, sadness, remorse, whatever. And I think that analogy is a good way to rebut that. And just for viewers' sake, I think that this actually has a term for it. This proposed solution to the problem. The phrase being the abominable fancy. Do you happen to know anything about that phrase and its origins?
No, you put that in the notes. I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah, I don't remember who coined that, but if people look it up, you'll see more about it. I'm happy to move on then to the next possible solution if you're comfortable. Is that okay, or do you want to say okay?
Yep, that's good.
All right, so let's move now to the second historically popular answer to the problem that Yang discusses in his treatment of the topic, and this he calls the partial amnesia solution. So cash that one out for us, and then we'll talk about its merits.
Sure. So again, this response is going to target a certain premise in the argument, and it's going to target that fourth premise. So the fourth premise was really crucial, and it said that if you have someone you loved, from your earthly life who's now in hell, then you are going to possess, if you possess eternal blessedness in heaven, this bliss in heaven, then you're going to be aware of where they're at. You're going to be aware of their fate, basically. So this view wants to target that and basically say, no, you don't have to be aware of their fate, actually. And essentially it wants to say that God will wipe the memories that you have of your lost loved one, either entirely, or he doesn't have to do it entirely. It could be that just those particular memories that would cause you suffering, he wipes those. But maybe you still have some scraps, left that you could remember the person, but it wouldn't fill you with suffering to remember. So it's a kind of memory wipe solution.
And to be,
did you want to say anything else?
Yeah,
there?
I was going to try to steelman a little bit, and you may have been about to go on to say this, in which case I apologize in advance for stealing your thunder. But I think that we can, people that want to leverage this solution don't necessarily have to be committed to the thought that God wipes people's memories. It could be, if I understood Yang's treatment of the topic correctly, that the redeemed in eternity are just so constantly overwhelmed by the bliss of heaven and all the goings on there that their mind just never turns to the lost loved ones that they had loved in life. Did I understand that rightly?
Yes, that's open to you as well. And I think Dr. Craig, he defends this view. I think he goes that route to basically say it doesn't have to be a memory wipe. It could be that, I think they call it I never know how to say the term, the Beatific Vision.
Beatific, I thought.
But once you
anyway.
see God, you're just so, captured up in just awe of him that you're not focused on anything else. You're just completely caught up in him. And so that's an option as well. Now, I guess this might get into a little bit of one's view of heaven. So this comes out really nicely in that book I mentioned, When Heaven's Getting Discussed. So if you have what's called a static view of heaven, then a static view of heaven's like, we're not going to be doing a bunch of things. Like we're basically going to be doing one thing for all of eternity, and that's just worship.
Like a literalistic reading
and that will never get old. That will never get tiring or boring. We'll just be doing that one thing forever. That's a very static view of heaven. And then there's like a dynamic view of heaven where we're given tasks to do, and we still are doing things. Those actions can be a form of worshiping God, but it's not like we're just doing this like one thing, which is you can almost imagine it kind of like going into a trance, and you just stay in this trance forever. That's like the static view. And then the dynamic view would be like, you're not in a trance, you're doing different things every day. So it could be, how you cash that out influences how good of a response you think this is.
Right. Please tell me that Yang and Davis go for the dynamic option.
They do a really good job at trying to stay even-handed in the book. So for every view that's offered, they try to offer criticisms. So I'm not totally sure which view they come down on, because I think they deliberately try to leave that for you to explore.
I see. Okay, well, they should go with the dynamic option.
If anything, I want to say I go with the dynamic option. I think there's actually there's scripture in support of that dynamic view.
Yeah, I think so too. And I also think that it resonates most, or it seems most consistent with the idea that creation... Let me put it this way. The static one that you've just described, which sounds to me like a very literalistic reading of the book of Revelation, let's say, that strikes me as borderline Gnostic in that it sort of treats life on, daily life in ordinary creation as it is, as something that is superfluous and can be sloughed off in eternity for just this static, trance-like thing or whatever. But it seems to me that's kind of problematic, because, look at before the fall, God gave Adam and Eve tasks and responsibilities.
Right. I think that's part of the biblical merit for it.
Good. Okay, well, so, again, what faults does Yang find in this answer, and what do you make of it? Would you agree with Yang that this seems pretty problematic?
Yeah, I don't think that this is my pick of the views, though, to be honest, I might favor this view more than the next two options. But that's not to say that that's because this view is very good. It's just I don't find the next two very, very satisfying. So some of the weaknesses that Dr. Yang points out is that, one, there might be scriptures that are in conflict with this view. And he points out that we, like a verse out of Hebrews, we have so great a cloud of witnesses. And depending on how you interpret that passage, it may be that those in heaven are aware of those here on earth, like their fate and everything. So, but I'm not going to get into whether that's the correct interpretation of that passage. It's just Dr. Yang lays out some scriptures that might be in tension with us actually having less knowledge in heaven than we did here on earth. But set that concern aside. The second concern, these next ones I find more strong. The first is it's difficult to really see how this is even supposed to work. So if it is like a memory wipe, then say it's, a spouse that you were married to for 50 or 60 years. So most of your life was spent with this person. If that person's completely taken out of your memory, there's going to be big chunks of you that are just missing, and you may wonder, hey, I remember, being 25, and then I don't really remember much else until I'm like 40. What happened to all those years? There's going to be like big gaps, and you may even, if God doesn't take out whole chunks and he just takes out the person that's in the memory, so you can kind of see in your mind's eye, where you were at, and maybe you remember the scene and everything, but you don't remember that person. Well, if it's something like, say, your wedding, what are you supposed to remember? You have a ring, but you're not putting it on anyone's finger. It's hard to see how it's really supposed to work.
Yeah.
But if you so say you go, we're not fooling with that memory wipe thing. Remember, we're saying God just catches you up in awe of him, this beatific vision. Well, we already mentioned, that may run into problems with a static view of heaven, or like the static view of heaven may be problematic for both scriptural and even philosophical reasons. But say that, God, every time you're about to have a memory that would cause you pain, God like kind of cranks up, so to speak, his awesomeness, so that you're about to look away, but then you're like, if that's what happened, it in some way it kind of makes God like either deceptive in some sense, so it could run into a problem like that where God's like trying to distract you and keep you from really seeing what's going on. So there may be some concerns there if God's a deceiver by making you think a bunch of things that think your life was a certain way that it wasn't really.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are some good reasons to question this solution. And I'll add a couple of other reasons, one of which you actually discussed briefly with Dr. Yang in her interview, although it may not have resonated as much with you because you hadn't seen the movie. And I don't know if you've seen it since that interview, but the movie was Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
I still haven't watched it. I want to.
You should. It's a really good movie, regardless of this topic. But in that movie, the character played by Jim Carrey, he has a breakup and he goes to a place to have his memory wiped of this woman that broke up with him. And suffice it to say that the increasing number of gaps in his memory and the loss of these memories is really troubling to him. And even though he went and wanted it, as it's happening to him, it's absolutely traumatic for him. And as the movie goes on, he's desperately clinging with more and more desperation to what fewer and fewer remaining memories he has of her. It's really fascinating, and that really resonates with me. And it at the same time seems to support an old adage. I think it's probably fairly old, but it's the old better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. It seems to me that the prospect of no longer remembering, for whatever reason, cherished loved ones in your past, even though they're gone from your presence, those memories seem valuable to me, and they're inherently valuable. And for God to prevent you from experiencing those memories by whatever means, whether we're talking a wipe or whether we're talking just overwhelming you with turning up the dial, as you said, those just don't resonate with the intuition that I have that the problems in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and in that phrase, better to have loved than lost than never to have loved at all, those seem intuitively to resonate with me. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the way Dr. Yang puts this point is it may actually do harm to the person for God to whether wipe their memory or just keep them from ever accessing those memories that they value so much again. It may actually do harm to the person, and I do resonate with that. So I don't find this view's super appealing.
All right. Well, then let's turn now to what Yang considers to be what he calls two underexplored responses, if not outright novel ones, which is not really the point of this discussion anyway. But the third solution that he offers, the first of these two underexplored ones, is one that sort of hangs on the attribute of impassibility. Maybe we could start by talking about what impassibility is. I think that the notion of divine impassibility is probably more often misunderstood than it is understood rightly. So for our viewers' sake, before we lay out this proposed solution to the problem, what would you, or how would Yang define the concept of impassibility?
So I've been reading Dr. John Peckham on this. He came out with a book recently on the attributes of God, and he's done quite a bit, from what I can tell, on the notion of passibility and impassibility. So I wanted to make sure I was getting this right. My understanding is there's two different versions of impassibility and divine impassibility. And so the first version wants to say that God has no emotions at all. That's like strict impassibility. That's one version you could go.
But does anybody actually...
Another is that God does have emotions. Okay, this is like, think of it like strong and soft. So it's like there's a strong or strict impassibility, and then there's a soft version. The soft version says God does have emotions, but they are active emotions, not passive emotions. So then what's the distinction between active and passive? Maybe you can help me out with this, because I didn't express it very well in my interview with Dr. Yang. The way I would put it now is that God can have emotions that he is the cause of. That's active emotions. When he's causing himself, if he's willing himself to have that emotion, then he has it. That's an active emotion. A passive emotion is he's not willing himself to have that emotion, but yet he still finds himself having that emotion. That's probably how I'd put it now. It's just, it's happening to you. He's got an external stimuli that is basically causing him to have an emotion. He's not willing that he'd have it. It's just happening to him. That's passive. And what this kind of soft version of impassibility wants to say is God doesn't have passive emotions. He has the active emotions.
I see. Yeah, I'll be interested. I'm actually going to be interviewing Dr. Peckham for an episode of my other show really soon, and I'm going to talk to him about this. I don't know if he would break it down in terms of active versus passive. I don't find that language all that particularly helpful, because it seems to me that emotions just are the kinds of things that result from thoughts or experiences or whatever. That's just what they are. I mean, I can't drum up any emotion. I feel emotion when I reflect on this or that thing or whatever. Now, somebody could disagree, and that's fine. That's not my point. I just think that the best understanding of impassibility is that God is not subject to passions. He is not. He is never out of control. Like you look at human beings, and we easily get riled up, and our emotions start to take over us. Just today, for example, I discovered that a recent debate opponent of mine is out there publicly slandering me and bearing false witness about our ministry, and I was fuming, just furious, and it really took prayer and several hours to calm down. And what I would understand the doctrine of impassibility to mean is that God isn't subject to his passions that way. He is always in perfect, righteous control over what his feelings are. And sometimes I think those feelings are negative, as we will discuss a little bit later in this conversation. But putting all that aside, let's now leverage the doctrine of impassibility, at least as Dr. Yang fleshes it out, active versus passive, and apply that to this proposed answer to the solution. Tell us how that would work.
So this again, we want to know what premise does this target. So this is supposed to target that second premise of the argument about if you're, I'm pulling it up.
Uh-oh, hold on. We're experiencing a network blip. Hold on one second. You're frozen. Sorry, folks. Hopefully Jordan comes back.
If you were still
okay, he's back. Start over with your answer there. We lost you for a few moments.
I don't know why that happened. Okay, so what I was saying was this response targets the second premise of the argument, and that premise says that anyone who still loves the person they loved in their earthly life, and they're aware that that person is being punished or they're damned, they can't possess perfect bliss. That's the premise. So this response wants to say, nope, that's incorrect. And the way that you go about it is kind of in two steps. The first step is to say God is impassible in that softer sense that I described, where he's the one that's causing the emotions, or he's in control of the emotions. I think you used the word control, maybe you didn't. But he's not experiencing any kind of passive emotions where an external stimuli is causing him to have that emotion. It's always he's the cause of his emotions. That's the way I would cash it out. So that's the first step. God is impassible in that sense. He has active emotions but not passive. And then the second step of the response is to say, and we, the people in heaven, are to become more and more like God. So that would mean they're to become more and more impassible, basically, in that softer sense. So that's the two-part response. And then it would be the case, if that is the case, then these people presumably in heaven would, even though they're seeing their loved ones suffering, or even if they're not seeing it, they're aware that their loved one is suffering in hell, or if they're not suffering, that they've been annihilated, they're gone, their life is over. If they're aware of that, that's not going to cause them to feel sadness and grief. Instead, whatever emotion they have, they would have to be the one that's in control of it, causing it or willing it.
Gotcha. So if they have become impassible in that sense, then the knowledge that their loved ones aren't with them, they won't be subject to the passive emotions affected by that knowledge, something along those lines. And
yeah, it's basically that knowledge wouldn't cause them to feel sadness or grief, because that's part of the view. There's no causing that's happening to you. You're the cause. You're the one that's willing it.
Right. Now, based on my reading of Dr. Yang, he does seem to think this solution is viable, even if he doesn't ultimately lean this way. But if I understood you correctly when you interviewed him, it did sound like this was the one you found to be most attractive. So now, whether
I'm not honestly attracted to any of his views. I'm going to be honest. Divine impassibility is just not attractive to me at all.
Okay.
When I read scripture, it just is it's so clear to me that God, I don't think, just has active emotions in this sense. It really seems like God is being caused to have emotions. He's responding basically to what he's seeing. And yeah, so I'm not attracted to. I don't accept this view, I think, because divine impassibility is so implausible to me.
Gotcha. Well, I want to take it a step further and say I think there may be more to the problem, more problems to than just that. Give me a moment to flesh this out. Although you've already seen it, I'll explain it for the listeners. So, in his treatment of this possible solution, as we've been discussing, Dr. Yang distinguishes between active emotions, which he says have historically been called affections, versus passive emotions, which have been called passions. And he suggests that compassion is active and pity is passive. So he wants to say, quote, God can have compassion for those who are suffering without having to experience any suffering himself. And he concludes, therefore, quote, God is also aware of those who are damned and even loves those consigned to hell, yet his happiness is not diminished in any way. And then he goes on to say, if we are made impassible in that sense, then neither will we suffer at the knowledge of our lost loved one's suffering. But here's my problem. At least as the way that he phrases it there, it seems to me that compassion, which he's calling active, would still move someone to sadness at the thought of suffering. And I think that Dr. Yang even admits as much, if only, sort of tentatively. He says a possible objection is that love and compassion, being active emotions possessed by the residents of heaven, would seek to improve the conditions of their loved ones. And I would point out personally that in a few places in Ezekiel, God insists that while he will execute death-dealing judgment if necessary, nevertheless, he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, which suggests, at least to me, that although he sees the punishment as just and as appropriate, nevertheless, it grieves him. And so for me, yeah, I agree. We will be made like God in a number of important ways, including in our, we'll have a perfected kind of compassion like his and a perspective like his. But if all of that's true, then I would think we too would be grieved by the ongoing punishment of our loved ones, no matter how just we recognize it to be. Would you kind of agree with most of that, or would you push back?
Yeah, I don't really see this solution even. Yeah, I think you made a great point. I don't see the solution really solving the problem, because even if God is the one willing himself to have this emotion, it still seems like he's experiencing some sense of grief or pain or sorrow at what he's seeing these people that he loved. So I don't really see this doing what you'd have to say is that God doesn't experience sorrow, doesn't experience grief, doesn't experience pain. I don't even know what compassion means. We'd have to really lay that out carefully. But if it doesn't include some level of empathy, which I think is fair to say, empathy is this, you're trying to feel what someone else feels, like if you're empathizing with them. Then if it doesn't include that, I don't know what exactly it's doing.
Yeah. I just recalled numerous times over the course of my life hearing not my parents, but parents in movies and TV and stuff punish their kids while saying, "This hurts me more than it does you." That is compassion, it seems to me. It's a recognition that this is important, this is the right thing to do, but it grieves me, and that strikes me as an emotion God would experience as well. Now, Yang goes on to add that the denizens of hell, this is a quote from him, the denizens of hell are such that their hearts are hardened, in the sense that they have cultivated certain characters whereby they can never freely choose to leave hell. Hence, God and the blessed, even though they would seek what's best for the denizens of hell, will nevertheless understand that nothing can be done to rescue them because they've hardened their hearts. But here's my pushback on that before we go to the fourth possible answer. Paul says in Romans 9 that he has, quote, great sorrow and unceasing anguish, unquote, for his fellow but unbelieving Israelites. And he goes on to say that those Israelites were hardened. In fact, God incarnate himself, Jesus, in Mark 3:5, is said to he is said to have been, quote, grieved at the Jews' hardness of heart. And the word grieved there derives from the same root as Paul's sorrow. Now, of course, neither Paul nor Jesus at that time were yet glorified, but nevertheless, Jesus was God incarnate. And Paul's sentiments are generally, I think, agreed to be righteous sentiments. It's righteous to feel sorrow over people that you feel kinship with who are perishing. So Yang's suggestion that somehow the knowledge the lost in hell have hardened their hearts and therefore have no hope, there's nothing more that could be done, that doesn't seem to sufficiently support this solution. Would you agree? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I think I agree. I won't add anything there.
Okay, I'm always encouraged when I try to do a little bit of philosophy and philosophers say I'm onto something, so it doesn't happen often. All right, well, let's turn now, fourth and finally, to the last of Yang's proposed solutions, the one that I think he is personally inclined to lean toward. And this is based on an old, what I'm guessing is Latin word, refrigerium. Explain this fourth proposed solution for us, and then we'll talk about it.
Okay, so essentially this word refrigerium means refreshment, if I'm understanding Dr. Yang correctly, and it gets the idea is pulled from that parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man asks that Lazarus, dip his finger in some water and touch his tongue. And Dr. Yang points to like an early church father, well, not super early, but Augustine, who is in writing somewhere, I forgot where, espousing this kind of view that maybe the lost receive refreshment from those in heaven, and that would mean that there's this kind of partial union or like a temporary union that those in heaven can have with the lost. So it's, as far as Dr. Yang cashes it out, it's not like it's ongoing all the time or something like that, but it's these kind of just temporary meetings that can be had where those in heaven care for the lost in some sense. Again, it's important to figure out what premise this is targeting. Dr. Yang says it targets that second premise, the same one that the impassibility does. I'm not totally sure that it does that. I'm not totally sure exactly what premise this one's targeting exactly. So that's like a question mark for me. It's not super clear to me. But let's say it does target that second premise. Okay. That's the basic idea. Then you wouldn't be separated from your loved one because you're still getting to meet with them in some sense regularly. So that's how this response applies. So maybe an imperfect but apt, I think, analogy would be, let's say a man goes to prison for life, and once every month or something like that, the wife gets to come and visit him. And we could even add in there, for people that are married who would know the value of this, we could mention conjugal visits, right? So they get to experience that, even that close unity of marriage, albeit in the prison context. So I guess the proposal would be that somehow by these periodic, imperfect but nevertheless real moments of relief, that somehow will make it possible for the redeemed to enjoy heaven forever, provided they periodically get to experience this kind of union with their lost loved ones. Is that the gist of it? Yep, that seems right. Okay, so you've already mentioned that it's not clear to you what premise of the original syllogism this is meant to answer, but that aside, what other thoughts do you have on this solution, and does it seem like a feasible solution to you? So I pointed this out to Dr. Yang, and he pushed back, but I still don't feel like it really's resolved the problem. And it's in this sense. There's kind of two different things going on, actually. So one of these is, yes, you get temporary reunion with your loved one, but if it's only temporary, I don't see how it's really going to satisfy that longing you have to be permanently reunited with the loved one. I imagine in your analogy, the wife that goes and visits the husband in prison, or if it's the other way around, however it works, they may be, really satisfied when they're with that person, but it seems like once they leave, they're probably going to be left, longing to be reunited, and then you're right back with the problem of, but now they're not experiencing this perfect bliss that you're supposed to have in heaven, at least during the times that you're not united with that loved one. Yeah, I don't see how that is going to get solved. Let me mention this other one real quick, and then you can chime in. The other one is that there's two elements going on here. One is you're being separated from your loved one, but the other is if they're suffering. So even if these temporary visits satisfy your desire for reunion and you're getting to see them, it seems like if they're suffering, you are still going to be sorrowful about that. And I mean, I would imagine, say it's like I'll tweak your analogy. It's like a hospital visit, so you get to go and visit your sick grandma every day. And say you decide you're able to do this, like, I'm just going to be her permanent caretaker. I'm just going to stay with her all the time and care for all of her needs. if she's really sick, you're still going to be sorrowful and sad about her sickness. So it just seems like there's two problems there that I don't get how this is going to solve.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll be touching on that distinction between separation and knowledge of suffering when we turn this to conditionalism. But before we do, let me say something that I think in Dr. Yang's own treatment of this solution that suggests that he's probably mistaken. See, one of the things I like about Dr. Yang is I get the impression that he's much like me in that he enjoys cinema. He enjoys film. He mentioned Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, but that actually wasn't even the movie that received the most of his attention in his work on this topic. The movie that he most references throughout his book chapter, anyway, not in his in the briefer treatment in the book you held up earlier. The book that he references most often, or the movie, is What Dreams May Come, which is a 1998 film starring Robin Williams. And in this movie, and this is for the sake of viewers, I'll cash this out for a minute. In that movie, the main character played by Robin Williams, his name is Chris, and he dies and he goes to heaven, but his wife, Annie, later commits suicide and goes to hell. Now, when Chris in heaven discovers that Annie is in hell, Chris drops everything and leaves heaven to go and try and rescue Annie from hell. And toward the end of the movie, they encounter each other there, where Chris is able to relieve at least some of Annie's pain. Now, based on that, Yang writes, quote, Chris, again, this is the character in the movie played by Robin Williams, can be the means by which Annie experiences momentary alleviation. Furthermore, the time of refreshment for Annie involves a temporary and sporadic union between Chris and Annie, so there is no eternal separation in the sense that they never see each other again, unquote. So the idea is if Chris could visit Annie periodically, even if not forever, and even if it's limited, that would mean that it's not an eternal separation in the sense that they could never see each other again. But my problem with his appeal to this movie here is that it just comes from watching the movie itself. Because after Chris finds Annie in hell, and after he relieves some of her suffering there, like there's a scene in which she's freaking out because she sees a tarantula, and he gets rid of the tarantula, and he says, see, everything's okay. And she experiences some relief. So he is able to relieve some of that suffering. But when that time with her is over, Chris awakens in heaven, and he appears to have failed to rescue her. He thinks he's back in heaven all by himself again. And immediately, despite having temporarily been reunited with Annie, he's immediately sad to be separated from her again. And so that's one of my problems with this Refrigerium answer, is that while brief and sporadic union with lost loved ones might bring brief and sporadic relief, it certainly wouldn't enable the redeemed to go on enjoying heaven. And it sounds to me like that was the first of the two objections that you explained. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, do you want to say any more about those before we move on to this next portion of our discussion?
No.
Okay.
I think we're good.
All right, so we've looked at how Yang offers these solutions, these defenses, when his sights, the sights of this syllogism, are set on the doctrine of eternal torment. And I personally don't think that any of those four proposals really resolve the problem when hell is thought to be eternal torment. But now let's shift gears and discuss the extent to which this is a problem for us conditionalists. And I want to begin by distinguishing between two concepts that Yang seems to me, anyway, to sort of conflate with one another. He doesn't do a good job of keeping them distinct and addressing them independently. So on the one hand, and you've read all this, but for the viewer's sake, let me explain this. On the one hand, Yang calls this problem the problem of, quote, eternal separation. And he uses variations of that phrase throughout his treatment of the topic, especially in his Refrigerium solution. So he says, quote, there can be intermittent moments of union. He speaks of partial union, some measure of union. And all of that kind of language suggests that the problem that needs solving here is the problem of the saints being separated from people that they loved in life. However, seemingly far more often, Yang hangs the problem on knowledge of the ongoing suffering of the lost in hell, as believed by adherents to the traditional view. So here, I'm just going to read a few quotes, a sampling, by the way. There's a lot more of these kinds of quotes between his book and his book chapter. So he says in one place, imagine that after you die, you end up in paradise. But suppose you find out that someone you love rejected God's offer of salvation and is now suffering in hell. And you also know that your loved one will experience everlasting misery. In another quote, he says, the heart of the problem, which is the eternal separation from loved ones, is how heavenly saints can remain happy while being aware that their beloved is suffering away from them. Another quote, the partial amnesia solution means, quote, the blessed in heaven are unaware of the condemned in hell. Another one, the conferred impassibility solution means the blessed in heaven can be fully aware of the damned in hell and yet not be harmed by such knowledge. Another quote, the putative tension, by the way, side note, until I prepared for this interview with you, I didn't know what putative meant. For viewers' sake, if you're interested, putative means like reputed. It means this is something that is thought by some to be such and such. So it's sort of like alleged, maybe is a somewhat kind of... Would that be a somewhat close synonym to putative, is alleged or purported?
I've seen that word pop up a lot, and I haven't investigated myself. What you just said fits the context of what I've read and what I've thought it meant, but I haven't even bothered to look it up.
Okay.
But I think you're right.
Okay. Well, I'll
the context from what I've read.
Yeah. So I'll use a word that is more clear to me. The purported tension, this is a quote, but he said putative. The purported tension stems from the assumption that the residents of heaven cannot be happy given the eternal suffering of those that they loved. Just a couple more quotes. If one loves someone, one suffers if one knows that one's beloved is suffering. He says in another place, it seems putatively or purportedly reasonable to suppose that the knowledge of the suffering of one's beloved causes the lover to suffer too. And then one last one. Historical theologians were not unaware of the problem of how the saints in heaven can be happy despite the misery of the damned in hell. Now, I would argue that Yang offers little, if almost anything at all, to substantiate there being a problem of separation per se, without also hanging the problem on knowledge of ongoing suffering. Now, we'll talk about separation in a moment, but I just wonder, would you agree that for the most part, the lion's share of this treatment of the problem hangs on knowledge of ongoing suffering rather than separation per se? Did you get that impression as well?
Yes, I did get that impression, and I just chalked it up to, at the beginning of that paper, he talks about traditional Christian claims, and he doesn't explicitly say that he's going to work within the framework of eternal conscious torment. But I just chalked it up to that the thing he's basically got in mind that's going on is the traditional view of hell, eternal conscious torment. And so that's why he uses these interchangeably, like separation from a loved one and suffering.
Okay.
But I agree. I wish he would have kept those separate and considered the annihilation view as well.
Well, let's try and steelman it a little bit, or at least I'll let you try to steelman it a little bit, and recognize that our view wouldn't suffer from the problem insofar as it hangs on knowledge of ongoing suffering, because in our view there isn't ongoing suffering. But nevertheless, there is this issue of us not having our lost loved ones anymore in the eschaton and forever. So how might you steelman the argument that simply lacking union with premortem loved ones in and of itself would stymie heavenly bliss, even if those lost loved ones have been destroyed in the trillions of years in the past, kind of thing? How might you steelman that argument?
I don't think the argument really changes, actually, because the words suffering don't appear in the argument that he gave. Instead, he just uses the language of eternally damned. And I think you and I probably want to agree to that, right?
Yes, but then eternally damned is an ambiguous phrase. Right? Because eternally, or maybe I should put it this way. Yeah, eternally damned. Because on the one hand, like, maybe ambiguous isn't the right word. It's under informative, right? I could agree to the premise if by eternally damned somebody means ongoingly suffering in hell. But if, on the other hand, someone understands that to mean they were destroyed in hell and will never live again, I would immediately reject the second premise.
Wait, so let me make sure I understood. So I'm thinking when I say that word damned, I think it's probably fair to substitute the word punishment. And I just learned this from you, from the whole Matthew 25 thing about eternal punishment. Like, hey, I remember you telling Al Mohler, we both believe in eternal punishment. It's just you think that it's this conscious torment thing, and I believe in eternal punishment, and it's this permanent destruction, basically. Am I right about that?
You are, but that's exactly my point, is that eternally damned could describe a fate that includes ongoing suffering, or a destruction that becomes increasingly into the past, to the point where it's been trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of years since your lost loved ones were destroyed. And given that word, the phrase, could refer to either of those two kinds of ideas, my immediate thought is, I would agree with premise number 2 if we're talking about the first of those two understandings of eternally damned, but I do not at all intuit or grant that premise is true if by eternally damned we mean they were destroyed a bajillion years ago.
Yeah, that's... so you asked me, let me back up, you asked me how would the argument change. I don't think the actual words in the argument would change, is what I meant. How you define those would change. And when we see the words eternally damned in the argument, we would just, the way we're defining it, or at least I'm thinking of it, is permanent destruction. So everything stays the same, you just put in the word permanent destruction. Now, you said immediately once you do that, for you at least, you're saying that second premise, and just for the viewers again, that second premise says, anyone who possesses love for their pre-mortem beloved and who is aware that those persons are permanently destroyed.
Were permanently destroyed, let's say that.
Bliss.
Let's use the past tense. Were permanently destroyed.
Were permanently destroyed. Yeah. Were permanently destroyed. Cannot possess perfect bliss. You're saying to you that becomes not intuitive at all.
Yeah.
For me, it's funny. For me, that seems equally problematic. Well, I say equally. It might be slightly more advantageous or slightly less problematic than the eternal conscious torment view, because you have the suffering going on, and we may bring this up in a moment. I think the advantage that the annihilationist view gives you in this particular argument is that at least you can look at, in remembering your loved one and thinking, at least they're not suffering anymore. You have that advantage over the eternal conscious torment view. So I think the annihilationist does have an advantage probably in that sense. One of my philosopher friends pushed back on that point. I think it's probably fair. You could tweak the eternal conscious torment thing to probably make it about equal to the annihilationist view. So I don't think it gives you leaps and bounds ahead. It still seems problematic to me.
So let me make sure I understand correctly. You're saying that your gut tells you that if let's say you've got an unbelieving loved one and they're destroyed in hell, you're saying your gut tells you that 1 trillion years later you would still fail to have perfect bliss.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
That's just something I can't relate to. That doesn't mean I'm right and you're wrong, obviously.
I think, and that might be where intuitions come in, but so for example, here was going to be, I want to try and pump your intuitions a little, and if you don't end up sharing my intuition, then that's fine. So here's what I was thinking of. It just seems to me, and I'll give you some examples to illustrate this. It seems to me that as long as there is continued love for that person that you loved in your earthly life, as long as your love for them remains, there will be a sense of sadness in some sense. It doesn't have to be like complete overwhelming, it's breaking you down every day, but there's going to be, it seems to me at least, that there's going to be a sense of sadness being separated from them. Especially, to me at least, especially if you don't even have the hope of being with them again.
Okay, well, here's the thing. I think I'm a case in point, because I have 2 unborn children that died. In fact, one of them died after we became believers and we had him cremated. I could go and show you I could go bring his urn right now and show you. And I, being something of a sort of hardcore Calvinist, do not think, or at the very least, I don't expect to be united with my son, this particular son, either of those 2 sons, in eternity, because I don't think that somebody can be saved apart from faith in Christ. So here I am, somebody who does not in any way have any hope of being reunited to my 2 sons, and yet, much as I still love those 2 sons, I don't experience sadness that knowing that they died years ago and I will never see them again, as far as I'm aware. Now, it could just be that I'm heartless and cold or something like that, but what I'd want to know is, why should I trust my intuitions any less than, let's say, yours?
Yeah, I'm not encouraging you to not trust your intuition, so I want to be clear about that. And let me say, I'm so sorry to hear that. I'd heard you say that on either a podcast, and it breaks my heart to hear that, so I'm really sorry that has happened. I do want to be clear about that. So yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, you're gonna, unless you have good reason to go against your intuition, then I would stick with your intuition. And I'm fine if at the end of the day people have different intuitions on things. It happens all the time in philosophy. I won't give examples, but it happens a lot where people just have different intuitions about stuff that's like kind of foundational. So for me, I look at that case and like I've met people, for example, who maybe have like a different story than you, I don't know, who they, raise their son, and their son, they're like the old parent. They're 80 something years old, and son's 60 something, and then the son dies traumatically all of a sudden out of nowhere, and they'll tell you, not a day goes by that I don't think about that child. And it's not to say that, again, it's not to say that they never are able to like cope with it, or they can still go about their lives, but when they have that memory of that son, because they still love them, there's some, even if it's like a mustard seed, like just a small, even if it's just a mustard seed, there's like this little bit of sadness in them that they're not with that person right now. That seems just so plausible to me, and that just seems to be my perception. I don't know, and it's okay if you don't share that.
Okay. Well,
I mean, would you say you have a mustard seed of sadness in you that you don't have that child with you? That they're not like in your home right now, and that you could walk out your door and go give them a hug? Like, is there any mustard seed of sadness in you that's not what you get to experience?
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's the case. No. Again, I don't know if I'm just hard-hearted or what, but yeah. Let me put it this way. When I give thought to my lost sons, I should say son, I don't know, we don't know what the first one we lost was, but at the very least, my 2 children that passed, when I think about them and my love for them, even if I were able to identify a mustard seed of sorrow or sadness or grief in some of those times of reflection, that's not always the case, at the very least. So it seems to me very plausible that it is possible to be consciously aware of your love for a loved one that has passed away, and do so without experiencing that mustard seed. Because, as I say, even if that mustard seed happens in some cases for me, it's not every time I think about my son.
Yeah.
So that would be...
Yeah, so, and yeah, for me, now I haven't, I'm thankful that I haven't lost a child, and I'm so sorry that you did. For me, at least from the loved ones that I have lost, I do have that sense of sorrow for not being with them, especially if it's someone that I think was lost. I have a sense of sorrow over that. It's not that it, consumes my day and I can't go about normal things. So presumably in heaven I could still worship God and love God, but there would just be this little, tinge of sorrow and sadness that it seems would remain with me.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to want to turn to a question before we start to wrap things up. But before we do, for those viewers who go and check out that book chapter that Yang does, I want to challenge what seemed to me to be the only real substantiation that Yang offers for the intuition that you just described. And it seems to me that substantiation is exclusively comes from his appeal to that movie, What Dreams May Come Again. Because here's what Dr. Yang says. Although Chris, again, the character played by Robin Williams, is capable of experiencing joy in heaven and is even reunited with his deceased daughter, it is separation from Annie that makes heaven unbearable for Chris. So even though his attempts to rescue her from suffering in hell prove futile, Chris, quote, nevertheless desires union, even if it is a union in the miseries of hell. Now, I think that there are a number of problems with this illustration that's meant to substantiate the intuition. But I want to focus on just one because we're taking a long time and I want to be sensitive to your time. And that is this. In the movie, Chris discovers in heaven that he and Annie are something more than merely a married couple. Specifically, he discovers that they are soulmates. And he's told in the movie that this phenomenon of soulmates is extremely rare. It's like, quote, twin souls tuned into each other, apparently even in death. And throughout the movie, that is the reason that Chris suffers sadness in heaven. He and Annie don't just love each other. They're metaphysical soulmates, whatever that is, something that's rare even in the world of the movie, and it's something that I think most Christians would say doesn't really exist at all, let alone among loved ones that aren't our spouses. And indeed, Chris isn't plagued by sadness in the movie caused by being separated from his children, even before they're reunited in heaven. So it strikes me as problematic to point to a story in which an extremely rare phenomenon makes it impossible for two lovers to be happy while separated, even though they can be happy without union with other loved ones, and even though Christian thinkers don't think such a phenomenon exists in reality, and then say that element of the story supports the notion that the saints couldn't enjoy heaven forever if separated from any of their loved ones at all. Now, I'm not asking you to say that the problem isn't faced by us. We just discussed that. But what I do want to know is, would you agree with me that at the very least, pointing to that movie and that particular thing in it probably doesn't work to substantiate the intuition, since it's for the reasons that I just explained?
Yeah, I'll tell you what this when I read this in the notes, what it reminded me of is kind of your complaint about the rich man and the Lazarus parable, how the people endorsing eternal conscious torment sometimes kind of press it for, every little detail is exactly, when really the parable wasn't intended to be that way. And I wonder if something like that could be said in favor of the movie. If you think of the movie kind of like a parable, we don't need to press it for the little things about, they're a soulmate, but not, he's not soulmates with his child. It just seems like it's expressing a kind of general sentiment that at least I probably share. So take that for what it's worth. I wouldn't say press the movie for such, details. It's just a kind of general sentiment. And I don't think the argument needs the concept of this like soulmate idea anyway. It just needs that what we typically think of as love for a child, love for a spouse, so I'm not as concerned maybe as you are at how the movie works these little things out. I think I just take it for generally what it is.
All right. Well, the reason why it matters to me is because, so far as I can tell, that's literally the only evidence that he points to for the separation aspect of the problem. As I said, the vast majority of it hinges on the ongoing suffering, and in the one place where it seems like he tries to substantiate the separation per se being a problem, he does so by pointing to a person in a movie who can't experience the bliss of heaven because he's not united to his wife, when the whole point of the movie is that they are more than just husband and wife. And he doesn't experience that kind of pain being separated from his children. So it just strikes me as I'd like to see him make the argument without appeal to a movie that really doesn't substantiate his argument in the first place. That's all I'm getting at. But let me ask you this then, before we turn move the sights again. What then, if you don't think that people can ever really fully move on after they lose a loved one, like I think we can, such that we no longer have that mustard seed of pain, even when we consciously think about our lost loved ones that were destroyed trillions of years ago. Even if you don't think that. And if you don't think that the solutions that he offers to the problem of eternal torment work, or at least ultimately, then my question for you is, how, as a conditionalist and as a philosophically inclined Christian, how would you then account for ongoing, unmitigated, unremitting bliss in heaven, even if you have the knowledge that you had loved ones in life that you will never experience union with? How would you solve the problem then, or what defense would you offer?
Yeah, let me say a couple things here. So I think maybe one reason, this just occurred to me, so I want to mention this. Maybe one reason I have the intuition is not that my sorrow is over some event in the distant past. Trillions of years pass and I'm still sorry about this thing way, way in the past. It seems like, at least the way I'm thinking of it, is my sorrow is over something right now in the present that I'm experiencing. And that is that right now in this moment, this person that I still love, even though they were, even though they're not, even though this happened in the distant past, this person that I still love, they're not with me right now. Almost, it seems very analogous to if someone just moved really far away and you never got to see them again. It seems very much analogous to that, where whether it's distance in time or distance in terms of location, I want them here with me right now. I would love for them to be experiencing heaven with me right now, but they're not. So it seems like I'm not grieving something in the distant past. I'm like something here and now in the present. And that's why I feel like it's not really. Now, you said never move on. Let me say something about that. I do think that people can go through the grieving process and complete grief. I definitely want to say that the grieving process, I don't want to say that I mentioned this because my wife has gone through actual real grief therapy, and she's got this book by psychologists and they don't talk about grief being healed, but they talk about the process being completed, and there can be a healthy way of doing that. But I still have this intuition that in the moments of sadness, or in those moments of remembering them and wanting them to be with you right now, and that desire is not able to be satisfied, there's at least some sense of sorrow there. So I just wanted to clarify that. Now, you asked me, so what's the solution, Jordan? I want to say I don't know. I don't know. And this is a fairly new problem to me. I mean, I've been aware of it for a little while, but it really wasn't until I started doing this interview with Yang. And I want to use this as kind of an encouragement to people. It's tempting in apologetics to be like, I need an answer. I need to have every little loose end tied up in a nice little bow. But something I really like about philosophy is that it is actually, I think, intellectually virtuous to be humble and admit when you don't know, and to be willing to, re-examine things and check again, and even be patient. Like, that patience in searching is a virtue, and it can be even an adventure to explore more and search. And so that's what I intend to do. I don't have a good answer. If I'm being completely honest, this looks like a good argument for universalism.
Well, that was...
I feel like this argument should make someone, at the very least, reconsider what they think about universalism. Now, that doesn't mean that they become a universalist automatically. That they may say, hey, the Bible clearly teaches that universalism is false. This argument looks like a good argument for universalism. So I'm going to say, I'm going to suspend judgment. I don't know. I take the Bible as my authority. I'll keep thinking about this problem. Hey, that's fine. But I don't have a good answer. Probably what I lean toward would be, I would deny the first premise. And somebody may think, gosh, that's costly. So let me say this again, what the first premise was. That first premise was, anyone in a state of eternal blessedness possesses both perfect bliss and continued love for their premortem beloved. I would want to probably deny that, and not the whole thing. I would say, yeah, they do have continued love for their premortem beloved, but I'd probably just deny the part that says they possess perfect bliss. And it depends on how you cash this out. You could even keep that part, I guess. What's meant by perfect bliss? That's the key. And I don't know that it's fully inappropriate to have a sense of sorrow in heaven. It seems like even if there's a good reason for something bad, it's still appropriate to grieve that, even if there's some really good reason for it. It seems like I don't know. I just look at Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers. Like, it brought about tremendous good and fed everyone. But I still want to say them selling him into slavery was a bad thing, and I can be sorrowful over how they treated him. And so it seems like, maybe in heaven there's an appropriate level of sorrow, and maybe you can just go that route.
I think that's plausible. I think if I weren't persuaded that the solution that I am inclined to believe in, if I were persuaded that that's not really plausible, then I'd probably just fall back on what you're saying as well. That, even if I were to grant that there's a mustard seed of sorrow when I reflect upon my son that I love but who passed away years ago, I think I would still say that doesn't prevent me from having a very, very joyous life. And all the more so in the presence of God and in the communion of his redeemed people, glorified, no longer suffering, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I think I could probably see myself buying that one day. But let's turn to universalism as the last part of this before we wrap up. You said that you think this could be considered a good argument for universalism. And if I'm right, you're in the position now where you're like, I don't have a good answer. This is all by itself a decent argument for universalism, but you're persuaded that the Bible doesn't really make any room for universalism. That sounds like where you're standing right now. Is that right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I still think, because the Bible teaches annihilationism, I hold to annihilationism. But what this has made me do is want to go and look at the Bible again. And I did it really rigorously. I'm pretty sure what I'll find, but hey, I want to try and be fair, and so I want to make sure that I've really accurately understood the Bible here. And at the very least, I'm okay if there are arguments for positions with conclusions that I don't hold, and they're strong arguments. It's just you weigh things out differently. It might be, this stuff over here weighs more than this argument for universalism, but it still can be evidence for universalism. I'm fine with that if that's how things shake out.
Well, let me tell you and just get your thoughts on this before we wrap up. The reason why I don't find it to be a very good argument for universalism is because of the kind of universalism that any Christian worth his salt or her salt would affirm. Namely, the sort of evangelical universalist position that says that on the day of judgment there will be many, not necessarily a majority, but many people that are lost and are sentenced to hell. They go to hell, and there they suffer until they exercise saving faith in Christ and repent, and then are rescued. And the evangelical universalists that I've read have said that the most stubborn, obstinate such sinners will plausibly remain there in hell for eons even. And it strikes me that the thought that 1,000 years from now my currently suffering lost loved one will eventually be saved won't make it possible for me to enjoy heaven for those 1,000 years. Going right back to that present suffering, the main problem that Yang talks about is the problem of the knowledge that your loved ones are suffering. If I know that my lost loved one is suffering, the knowledge that one day, thousands of years from now, or eons from now, they might repent and be saved, does not at all make it possible for me to enjoy heaven waiting for that to happen. And so for me, it's actually not a good argument for universalism, unless it's sort of the outright pluralistic heretical form of universalism that just says everybody goes to heaven regardless of what they believe. Do you think that there...
Yeah, I don't think I would lean at all toward that one. I definitely want to say, salvation's by grace through faith in Christ alone. Like I want to be, very strong about that. But my thought about what you just said, and if I'm going too long, just tell me and I'll stop. My thought about what you just said is, it seems like, say 1,000 years go by, and during that whole 1,000 years, I was like really sorrowful every day that I knew my loved one was suffering. But then the day comes, and now we get millions and millions and millions of years together. I may very well look and be like, hey, it was all worth it to go through that 1,000 years to enjoy these millions of years with you, versus you were just annihilated, and then I never got any time with you.
Yeah, but the argument isn't that perfect bliss will eventually be possible in heaven. The argument has to do with whether perfect bliss is possible in heaven at all. And so if you're in heaven for 1,000 years, knowing that your loved one is suffering and it may take eons before they repent and are saved, yeah, sure, a billion years from now when they're saved, you might be like, okay, now I can enjoy heaven, but what about the billion years prior to that? How could you enjoy heaven during those billion years?
Yeah. I'm definitely sympathetic to that. I made this point at the end of the interview with Dr. Yang. I said, hey, depending on how you cash out universalism, and what I meant by that was that kind of two versions you were talking about, and I would want to lead toward the more evangelical, stances on salvation through Christ. So anyway, it seems like even on that model, there's going to be a temporary period of suffering. But it just seems to me, at least, that the eternal conscious torment view and the annihilationist view have that suffering, even if it's just a little tinge of it, for eternity. But the universalist view will have it temporarily, but ultimately it gets satisfied. And so, yes, you're left with a period, and it could be a really long period, but not relative to the whole thing. That period will be like a drop in the bucket overall. Whereas on the annihilationist view and the eternal conscious torment view, the whole bucket is just got little tinges of sorrow through it. So it seems like the universalist has the advantage, at least to me anyway, it seems like they have the advantage over the other two views when it comes to this, even if there's a temporary period of separation and sorrow. Okay,
but I just want to be clear, though, you at least sense the challenge from the notion that even if after your lost loved one is saved out of hell, you might then see the past bajillion years of pain as a drop in the bucket. Nevertheless, during those bajillion years while you're in heaven supposedly experiencing bliss, that's not going to be very possible while you know during those bajillion years that your loved one's suffering. So you still end up with a real inconsistency, an incompatibility between being able to enjoy heaven and know that your lost ones are suffering, right? Even if a bajillion years from now they're saved and you can look back and say, okay, now I can enjoy it and all those bajillion years were worth it, fine. But what I'm saying is if the problem is supposed to have to do with whether you can enjoy heaven separated from your loved ones, knowing that they're suffering, then the universalist, or at least the one that can have in any way, shape, or form, any claim to the name Christian, the evangelical universalist has to say, actually, for potentially bajillions of years, you're not enjoying heaven.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. It just seems like that view does eventually reach fulfillment, but the others don't.
Sure.
So it seems like the others, you never reach fulfillment in heaven. But on the universalist picture, you eventually do.
But for potentially a bajillion years, heaven is hell.
A drop in the bucket.
But a hell you experience for a bajillion years, supposedly in heaven. Yeah, okay. All right. Obviously, we're not going to 100% see it eye to eye on that, but that's okay. I just, I don't get why anybody thinks that that's attractive. But anyway, this has been really good. I appreciate it. And I really want people to check out your ministry, and we'll talk about that in a minute again and remind viewers where they can go to check it out. But one of the things that I like doing, as you probably know, having watched some of my things, is I like to give many of my interview guests a chance after a 2-hour-long conversation like the one we've had today, to give our viewers something of a parting message, something that you'd like them to be thinking about after this interview's over, even if they forget virtually everything we've been talking about for 2 hours. So if you could leave viewers with something to be thinking about, something to encourage them, something to motivate them to think through these issues or whatever, what might that parting message be as we wrap things up now?
I guess part of what we're doing here is even when there's a lot of agreement and there's disagreement, we still have love for one another, respect for one another, and we're wanting to ultimately honor God. Make that the goal, make that a priority in your life.
Hold on, Jordan. I'm sorry. We
seek God. You can be a form of worship.
Sorry, we had another internet hiccup, and right as you started the answer to that question, you froze. So start over if you wouldn't mind. I'm sorry.
I said, make it a priority in your life to honor God through conversations like these. There can be a lot of agreement, a lot of disagreement, but Chris and I feel like have respected one another even in the midst of some disagreement, though largely we're in agreement, and we want to have more conversations like that. So seek to honor God, and when you're challenged by some argument, don't go that route alone. Seek the best thinkers you can find around you, and seek God in prayer and bring it before Him. It should very much be a faithful journey. So that's my basic message.
Well, I think it's a good message, and I'd love for viewers to consider your ministry part of their ability to do just that very thing that you just described. So just remind our viewers that weren't around for the first few minutes when I first got this information from you, where they can go to find your ministry online.
Yes, it is. The YouTube channel is The Analytic Christian, and you can go to my website as well, theanalyticchristian.com. And if you don't mind me throwing this in, right now, if you become a patron of my ministry for any amount of money, you have an opportunity to win 3 books. So one is called Postmortem Opportunity, about the possibility of salvation after death, by James Bilby. I just did an interview with him. Another is called Debating Christian Theism, edited by J.P. Moreland and Chad Meister. And then the third is by Dr. Kevin Tempe on philosophical theology and free will. So they're really good books, and I'm going to give them to one of my patrons, whichever patron asks the best question. So you send me a question that you've got. Maybe it's this question, But send me a question you've got that's really been bugging you. I will find a scholar to answer that question. And if you ask the best one, I'm actually giving it away to 2 winners. So the 2 best questions win all 3 books, and you get your question answered in a video.
Awesome. I encourage people to check those out, and at your website or by some other means, if viewers want to get in contact with you, is that something they might be able to do? Can you tell them how to do that?
Probably the easiest way to get in contact with me is through Facebook. So I have a Facebook page, The Analytic Christian, and if you just send me a message there, it's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me.
Awesome. And my friend and moderator Susan in the chat included a link in the chat to your YouTube channel and encouraged people to go get a free book. So thank you, Jordan. I really admire you, and it was a real pleasure and honor to be able to have you on the show and discuss this topic with you, even if we disagree a very small bit there on the last thing there. But thank you for coming on the show. Thank you also for being a public conditionalist, even if you're kind of only tentatively convinced of it. We conditionalists very often we rejoice every time we find out a new public conditionalist, because it's going to become increasingly difficult for traditionalists to divide from us and exclude us from fellowship and ministry with them, because before too long they're going to have to divide from half the church. So thank you. But that aside, again, I just want to reiterate, thank you so much for coming on the show and for giving me 2 hours of your time today. I really appreciate it.
I was thrilled to get to come on and speak with you, because you, like I said, played an important role in changing my mind on hell. So thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Thanks again. Okay, 1 second, Jordan. Let me wrap up the show. All right, well, I hope that you enjoyed the interview. Jordan is a fantastic guy, and I would highly encourage you to check out his ministry. I'm going to be watching it more now that I've discovered it. Again, if you liked this video, click the like button, subscribe, receive notifications, all of that stuff. I'd be super grateful for that. And come back 2 weeks from today for the next episode of Rethinking Hell Live. What I think I'll probably be doing is a response video to a internet counter-apologist of sorts who goes by the strange moniker Morgue. Morgue recently published a video saying that Jesus invented the concept of hell, and I'll very much be looking forward to debunking that claim on the next episode of Rethinking Hell Live. So come back in 2 weeks from today. That'll be Monday, May 24th at the usual time, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. And until then, I'll as my friend Darren Clark often says at the end of our podcast episodes, stay strong for conditionalism. I'll see you next time.
Man, look, maybe we should rethink this whole thing. I mean, you heard the guy.
The pains of eternal torment.
Yeah, I gotta rethink this whole thing.